A man walked into a blind date planning to leave in 10 minutes. He stayed 4 hours. And when she finally found out who he really was, the most feared crime lord in Seoul, everything they'd built in those 4 hours turned to ash. This is the story of a monster who learned to want something he didn't know how to keep, and a woman who had to decide whether a man could ever truly outrun what he is. Stay until the end. Like the video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Geese? The rain had been falling since noon and showed no sign of stopping. Kang Ji-hoon stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 42nd floor of a building he technically didn't own. His name appeared nowhere in the title documents, buried instead under 3 layers of shell corporations and 2 lawyers who knew better than to ask questions. Below him, Seoul bled neon into the wet streets, red and gold and the cold blue of convenience store signs smearing across the pavement like something wounded. He watched a taxi hydroplane slightly at the intersection on Tehran Row and then correct, the driver probably swearing, probably not knowing how close he'd come to the concrete barrier. Ji-hoon watched and felt nothing in particular. That was his baseline. It had been his baseline for so long that he no longer noticed it the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator. Numbness wasn't a wound anymore. It was furniture. Behind him, his chief of security, a thick-necked man named Ryu, who had been with him for 11 years and once taken a knife meant for Ji-hoon's kidney without flinching, cleared his throat. The Busan shipment cleared customs, Ryu said. No complications. Good. Park Seong-woo's people made contact again. They want a meeting. Tell them I'm busy. That's the 3rd time this month, boss. Ji-hoon didn't turn around. Then tell them I'm very busy. He heard Ryu shift his weight, that particular shuffle that meant the man had more to say, and was doing the math on whether to say it. Ryu usually did the math correctly. Also, Ryu said, Mr. Choi called. Ji-hoon turned at that. Not because Choi Dae-jung was a significant business contact. He wasn't, not anymore. He'd been Ji-hoon's closest friend at 12 years old, when both of them were scholarship kids at a school that made its wealth visible in the quality of other students' shoes. And he remained the only person alive who sometimes called Ji-hoon by his first name without calculating the risk first. Choi now ran a mid-sized logistics company, kept his hands clean, had a wife who made excellent kimchi jjigae, and 2 kids who played piano. He existed in Ji-hoon's life as a kind of artifact, evidence that a different version of the story had been possible. What did he want? Ryu's expression did something careful. He asked if you'd be willing to do him a favor, a personal favor. What kind? He has a work colleague. The colleague set up a blind date but had a family emergency and can't make it. He wanted to know if you'd stand in for the evening. Ji-hoon looked at Ryu. Ryu looked back at him with the expression of a man who was absolutely not going to offer an opinion. A blind date, Ji-hoon said. Yes, sir. Choi wants me to go on a blind date. In his place. He said the woman is a foreign student, international. She doesn't know anyone well in Seoul yet, and the colleague didn't want her sitting alone in a cafe waiting for someone who wasn't coming. He thought you might be willing to sit for a few minutes. Make sure she's not embarrassed. Ji-hoon turned back to the window. A few minutes. He had a criminal empire running across 4 cities, a rival who was testing the fences of his territory with increasing confidence, and a shipment of documents that needed reviewing before morning. He should say no. He was going to say no. Choi knew better than to ask him for something like this, which meant Choi was either desperate or operating on old affection, the residue of 20 years of history that Ji-hoon had never quite managed to drain away. 10 minutes, Ji-hoon said. Tell him I'll go. I'll sit for 10 minutes, make sure she has a drink, and leave. Ryu didn't quite manage to keep the surprise off his face. Yes, sir. And Ryu, don't make it weird. Sir? I know what your face is doing right now. Stop it. Ma. The cafe was near Yonsei University, wedged between a convenience store and a bookshop that appeared to be losing its argument with entropy. Tilted shelves visible through the window, towers of paperbacks organized by some system only the owner understood. The cafe itself was the kind of place that made its living on graduate students. Mismatched furniture, jazz that was trying too hard, the smell of espresso, and the low-grade anxiety of people writing theses. Ji-hoon arrived in the back of an unmarked car, told his 2 security men to wait down the block, and pushed through the glass door into warmth and noise and the particular density of other people's conversations. He'd had Ryu send a photo. He scanned the room and found her immediately, which was not difficult. She was the only person in the cafe sitting alone at a table for 2, with the particular posture of someone who has decided to look unbothered about sitting alone at a table for 2. A large textbook was open in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching the door with the careful neutrality of someone who has been watching the door for 20 minutes and has made a private decision that they will watch it for exactly 10 more before they leave with their dignity. She had a half-drunk Americano at her elbow and a pen she was clicking with her right hand, not nervous exactly, more like thinking, more like a mind that didn't idle well. He noticed this the way he noticed the rain, factually, without attaching much to it. Extraordinarily striking. Not in a way that matched anything in his experience of what striking was supposed to look like. She had natural hair pinned up with something that was losing the fight, 2 or 3 coils escaping around her face, and she was wearing a dark green sweater that had seen better days. And she looked like someone who had come from somewhere warm and hadn't fully made her peace with Seoul in October. Ji-hoon crossed the cafe and stopped at her table. She looked up. For a fraction of a second, something moved across her face. Adjustment, recalibration, and then she settled into a careful neutral. "Amara Johnson?" he said. His English was fluent and flat, the accent of someone who learned from textbooks and then spent years in rooms with Americans. "That's me," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, unhurried, with the particular cadence of the American South smoothed down by years somewhere else, but not erased. "And you're not Daniel." "No," he said. "I'm not Daniel. Daniel had a family situation. I'm Ji-hoon. I'm a friend of Dae-jung's. He asked me to come." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the way people usually looked at him. Most people looked at Ji-hoon with a layer of anxiety they were trying to hide, some knowledge or half-knowledge of what he was bleeding through their social behavior. She looked at him the way someone reads a document they haven't decided whether to trust yet. "So Dae-jung sent a substitute," she said, "for his colleague's date. He didn't want you sitting alone. I'm sitting alone right now." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Less alone now." She looked at the chair, then back at him, and something at the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more reluctant than that. Something that happened before the decision to smile was made. "You have a point," she said. "Can I ask what you do, since we're apparently doing this?" He flagged down a server and ordered coffee, black, before answering. "Business," he said, which was true. "Investment, logistics, also technically true." "What about you?" "Law," she said. "International law. I'm doing a year at Yonsei on an exchange program before I finish my degree." "Where?" "Georgetown, Washington, D.C. She picked up her pen again, clicked it once. "Before you ask, yes, I know it's a long way. Yes, I know my Korean is not great. And yes, I do think the weather here is trying to kill me specifically." He almost smiled. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he didn't do it. "Why Seoul?" "Why not Seoul?" She tilted her head. "Genuine question. Why is that always the first thing people ask, like it needs a justification?" "It doesn't," he said. "I was asking about your reasons, not questioning the decision." She studied him. "Corporate law and international markets," she said. "The intersection of Korean business law and American regulatory frameworks. If you want to work in international compliance, Seoul is one of 3 cities in the world worth being in right now." She paused. "Also, I wanted to be somewhere completely different and see if I could hold myself together. But mostly the first reason." The coffee arrived. Ji-hoon wrapped his hand around the cup and looked at her, and he noticed this the way you notice you've been walking in the wrong direction. Past his 10 minutes. He didn't leave. They argued about power for 45 minutes. It started because she asked what kind of investments, and he said he preferred sectors where leverage was structural rather than competitive. And she said that was an interesting way to avoid saying you benefited from other people's inability to negotiate from strength. And he said that was an interesting way to avoid engaging with how markets actually function. And from there, it went somewhere neither of them had apparently planned. She was sharp. Not the performed sharpness of someone demonstrating that they are smart, the actual thing, unselfconscious, following an argument wherever it led, without caring about being correct as much as about understanding the shape of the problem. She listened to him. Most people in conversations with Ji Hoon were waiting for gaps in his speech where they could agree with him. She was listening with the particular attention of someone who was planning to push back. "The issue isn't that power exists," she said. "Power always exists. The issue is that you're describing a system where the people with structural leverage have no accountability to the people without it, and then you call that a market. Markets self-correct. Through what mechanism? Because from where I'm standing, the correction usually happens to the people who didn't have the leverage in the first place. The correction happens to everyone eventually." "That's cold comfort if you're gone before the correction." He looked at her. "Most people would find this conversation uncomfortable," he said. "Most people are trying to impress you," she said. "I don't know you. I have no idea who you are, which means I can just talk." She picked up her Americano. "Is that unusual?" He considered the question seriously because she asked it seriously. "Yes," he said, "it is." She nodded like that confirmed something, not smugly, just noting data. "That's kind of sad," she said, and she didn't say it like an insult. He didn't answer. Outside, the rain had thickened. The cafe had filled up around them without either of them noticing. Graduate students with laptops, two older women sharing a piece of cake, a group of undergraduates who were very loudly not studying. The jazz had cycled through several albums worth and landed somewhere quieter. "Why law?" he asked. "Because the world runs on systems," she said, "and systems can be changed if you understand how they're built. Law is the language systems use. If you want to fix something, really fix it, not just patch it. You have to learn the language." She turned her cup on its saucer. "My grandmother was a domestic worker in Atlanta for 30 years. The family she worked for was wealthy, educated, considered themselves good people. They paid her below minimum wage for most of that time, because there was an exemption, and they knew about the exemption, and she didn't. She wasn't done wrong by bad people. She was done wrong by a gap in a statute." She paused. "I'm going to spend my life closing gaps in statutes." Ji Hoon was quiet for a moment. "That's specific," he said. "Most good reasons are." He looked at her. The lamp on the table between them cast light at an angle across her face, catching the corner of her eye. She was still turning her cup on the saucer, a small, habitual motion, not performing anything, just present in the way people are when they're not trying to be anything in particular. He had been in this cafe for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He didn't leave. Then she asked him, around the third cup of coffee, what he'd wanted to be when he was young. It was the kind of question that shouldn't have landed. He'd been asked versions of it before, at galas, at business dinners, asked by people who wanted to demonstrate their emotional accessibility, and he'd always answered it the same way. Deflection dressed as self-deprecation, something about never being much for planning, and the subject changed. It was a reliable technique. He'd used it so long, it had become automatic. He opened his mouth to use it now. "An architect," he said instead. He didn't know why he said it. It was true, truer than almost anything he said in conversation, but truth was a resource he managed carefully, and he hadn't decided to spend it here, and yet there it was sitting on the table between them. She didn't make a thing of it. That was what surprised him. She just nodded, like the information fit somewhere in a picture she was building. "What kind?" she asked. "I wanted to design public spaces, parks, civic buildings, places that were meant for everyone and not just for the people who could pay for access." He heard himself saying it and felt something strange. Not embarrassment, something older than embarrassment, the ache of a version of yourself you remember and can't quite look at directly. "I was 12 when I decided that. By 15, I decided something else." "What changed?" He looked at her. "The world," he said. "The world changed, or I understood it better, one or the other." She held his gaze. "Those aren't the same thing," she said quietly. "Understanding something and having it change are not the same thing." "I know." "So which was it?" He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway because it gave him something to do with his hands while he sat with the fact that she had followed the sentence exactly where he'd tried to leave it unfinished, and she hadn't let him leave it there. I grew up in a neighborhood where the architecture was failing infrastructure, he said. Water damage, electrical problems, elevators that were out of service for 18 months and then 19 months because the building owner knew the residents couldn't afford to go anywhere else. My mother worked herself sick in that building. He stopped. I learned that structures exist to serve whoever owns them. That was the education I got. It wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just very specific. And once you learn something specific about how the world works, it's difficult to unlearn. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your mother, she said. She's fine, he said. She lives in Se Jun now. I bought her a house. Good. She said it without the slight wince people sometimes added, like they needed to signal that buying a house was adequate consolation for the rest of it. She just took it as information. But you're still carrying the education. Most people are still carrying their education. Some more comfortably than others. He looked at the table. Somewhere in the distance, a phone buzzed. His, in his pocket, Ryu checking in for the second or possibly third time. He ignored it. Why did you agree to come tonight? She asked. Daijung's your friend. He called in a favor. But you don't seem like someone who does things because they're asked. You seem like someone who does things because they've decided to. It was, again, precise. He looked at her and thought that she had the kind of intelligence that was dangerous, not because it was aggressive, but because it was patient. She didn't need to win the argument, she was just following the actual shape of things, and the shape of things had a way of arriving somewhere uncomfortable if you followed it long enough. I told him 10 minutes, Se Jun said. She glanced at her watch, then back at him. Something that was almost but not quite a smile again. That same reluctant preliminary thing. It's been 3 hours and 40 minutes, she said. I know. Any particular reason you stayed? He looked at her. For a moment, the cafe and the rain and the jazz and the 3.5 hours all sat around them like furniture. I'm not sure yet, he said. Which was honest. It was the most honest thing he'd said in a room that wasn't his own office in years, possibly longer, possibly so long that he'd forgotten what the practice felt like. She nodded slowly, like that answer was acceptable, like she understood that some things needed more time before they had names. Well, she said, I have a seminar at 9 tomorrow. I'll let you go, he said. Neither of them moved. They left the cafe at 11:47. Outside, the rain had softened to drizzle, and the street smelled like wet concrete and someone's late-night tteokbokki cart 2 blocks over. Amara pulled her jacket tighter and looked at the sky with an expression of personal affront. It rains like it's angry here, she said. Atlanta rain is loud and dramatic, and then it's done. This stuff just persists. You get used to it. I resent that that's probably true. She turned to face him on the sidewalk. Without the cafe around them, she looked younger and less defended, or maybe the same, and he was seeing it differently. Thank you, she said, for coming, for staying. You didn't have to. I know. I mean, you genuinely didn't have to. I would have been fine. I was fine before you got here. I know that too. She studied him for a moment. Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things all evening. One more. He nodded. Why does it feel like you're not all the way here, she said. Like part of you is always somewhere else, doing a calculation, running the numbers on something. She tilted her head, watching him. What is it you're actually thinking about most of the time? The question hit him somewhere unexpected. He had good defenses. He had layers of practiced response and curated self-presentation and the ability to be in a room with almost anyone and leave them with the impression he'd intended. She had spent 4 hours finding the seams in all of that without appearing to look for them. Things I can't talk about in this context, he said, which was as close to true as he could get. She held his gaze for a moment and he saw her make a decision. Not to push, not tonight, not yet. Because she was also someone who followed her own assessment of the situation, and her assessment was that this was an opening, not an answer, and openings had their own timing. Okay, she said. Fair enough. She pulled out her phone. I'm going to give you my number because I think this was good, and I don't have many people here yet who I can actually talk to. She looked up. Is that okay? Yes, he said, immediately without calculating it. She typed in her number and sent him a text with a small checkmark emoji, and when his phone buzzed in his pocket, he took it out and looked at it and saved the contact under her name, and she watched him do it with the expression of someone who was filing something away. "Good night, Ji-hoon," she said. "Good night," he said. He watched her walk to the corner and flag down a taxi and get in, and the taxi pulled into the drizzle and its red taillights blurred in the wet air, and he stood there for a moment after it was gone, doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for him. Ryu materialized at his elbow. "Sir?" "I know. The Busan documents tomorrow." Ryu said nothing. Ji-hoon walked to the car and got in and looked out the window at the wet city all the way back to the tower on Tehran Row, and he was thinking about the way she'd asked, "Why does it feel like you're not all the way here?" And he was thinking about the fact that he didn't have a good answer. And he was thinking, this was the thing that was hard to look at directly, that he couldn't remember the last time someone had noticed that he wasn't all the way present and had found it worth asking about, rather than finding it intimidating or simply adapting to it. He sat with that thought until the car reached the building's parking structure, and the thought went somewhere else, filed under a category he didn't have good language for yet. He called Choi the next morning. "How was it?" Choi asked, and Ji-hoon could hear the grin in his voice, the particular Choi Dae-jung grin that had gotten them both into and out of trouble at 12, 13, 15. "Fine," Ji-hoon said. "Fine. You stayed 4 hours, Ji-hoon. My colleague texted me at midnight saying some incredibly handsome substitute showed up, and she stayed talking to him until almost midnight, and she doesn't know what happened." She relayed that. "She relayed the handsome part specifically, yes. I'm telling you because I thought you'd find it funny." Ji-hoon didn't find it funny or unfunny. He found it. Something without a clear category. "She's smart," he said. "She is," Choi said. Dae-jung's colleague says she's one of the sharpest students in her program, going to be a serious lawyer. Ji-hoon thought about gaps in statutes, about water damage in failing buildings, about the way she'd followed the sentence he'd tried to leave unfinished. "Did you know she was going to be like that?" he asked. Choi paused. "Like what?" Ji-hoon looked at the window and the morning Seoul traffic 20 stories below. "Never mind," he said. "Thanks for asking me to go." Choi said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of response. Then, "Ji-hoon." "What?" "Be careful." Ji-hoon hung up. He texted her 3 days later. No specific reason, no occasion. He saw an article about a world court ruling on an international trade dispute and thought she'd have a reaction to it, and before he'd made a conscious decision, he'd sent it to her with a single question. "Thoughts?" She replied in 11 minutes. The reply was 4 paragraphs long and anatomized the ruling's flaws with the precision of someone who'd thought about the underlying doctrine for years. He read it twice. He replied. She replied. They went back and forth for 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, the conversation slid off the ruling and onto something else. She told him about a professor who assigned Kafka to law students to teach them about bureaucratic surreality, which she thought was either brilliant or cruel, probably both. He told her about a building he'd seen once in Busan, an old Japanese colonial structure that had been converted badly and then reconverted well, the bones of the original visible in the proportions if you knew to look. She said, "You still see like an architect." He sat with that for a long time before responding. Over the next 3 weeks, he found reasons to be near Yonsei that he hadn't previously found. He told himself it was proximity. His holdings in Sinchon required attention, which was technically true, and he made sure that when he texted her it was for identifiable reasons, articles or questions about something she'd mentioned, never anything that could be called reaching. He was managing it. He was keeping it at the appropriate distance. Then she texted him at 10:30 on a Tuesday. "Are you busy?" "I have a legal question that isn't technically a legal question." He moved his 11 o'clock. They met at a different cafe, one she chose. Smaller, louder, the kind of place where the table was sticky and the music was too loud and nobody cared. She had her laptop open and a half-eaten bowl of ramyun going cold, and the specific expression of someone who has been arguing with a document for 3 hours and has achieved only increasing anger. "Okay," she said without preamble when he sat down. "I need you to tell me how a business legally insulates itself from regulatory accountability." Not because I want to do it, because I'm writing a paper about how it's done so I can argue it should be stopped. And every article I find is either too theoretical or written by the people who want to keep doing it." He looked at her. He thought about shell corporations and title documents and 3 layers of legal separation and lawyers who knew better than to ask questions. "That," he said carefully, "is a large topic. I know. Just start somewhere. How do you make something invisible to a regulator?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he started explaining, carefully, in the abstract, the structural mechanics of regulatory distance. He kept it theoretical. He used examples that were public knowledge, academic cases. But she followed every step, asking exactly the right clarifying questions, mapping the territory with the particular methodical thoroughness of someone who was building something. An hour later, she sat back and looked at him. "You know a lot about this for an investment guy," she said. "I've been on the business side of regulatory disputes," he said. "Right." She looked at him for a beat longer than usual. Then she looked back at her laptop and started typing, and he watched her work. And he thought about Choi's voice on the phone saying, "Be careful." And he thought, yes, but careful about which part. The moment he saw it was 3 weeks later, outside her university. He'd come to the Se Jun office. Legitimately, there was a meeting. And afterward, he was walking to the car 2 streets over because he'd told the driver to move. And he turned a corner, and there she was, 30 meters ahead on the pavement, stopped, staring at her phone. He was about to raise his hand when he saw what she was looking at. He was on her phone. Not him. His photo. A photo he recognized, one that circulated in certain contexts, sharp-suited, unsmiling, the Seoul skyline behind him. Not a public photo, a photo that appeared in the kind of publications and reports that tracked the structure of Korean organized crime. Alongside it, from the angle he could read briefly before she looked up and saw him, text he didn't need to read because he knew what it said. His name, his family, the abbreviated version of everything he was. She looked up. She saw him. The space between them was 30 meters of wet pavement and several seconds of complete silence, during which he watched her face do something he had not expected and could not entirely prepare for. Not fear, not the careful adjustment of people who learned what he was and immediately recalibrated their behavior around that knowledge. Something more direct than that. Something that looked, from 30 meters, like the expression of someone who has just understood that they have been given wrong information about the terrain and has placed their foot somewhere it should not be. She looked at the phone, at him, at the phone again. He walked toward her because there was nothing else to do. "Ji-hoon," she said when he was close enough. Her voice was even. He had noticed before that she had a particular evenness when she was most unsettled, a steadiness that came from choosing control rather than having it naturally. "Who are you?" Not a question. The grammar of it. Statement, declarative, present tense. The grammar of someone who already knows and is deciding whether to give the other person the space to say it first. "What did you find?" he said. She turned the phone toward him. The photo. The text. His name. And below it, in the compact phrasing of someone who had done their research. Head of the Kang organization, alleged control of extortion and trafficking networks across Seoul, Busan, and Incheon, estimated to generate upward of 200 million US annually through— "Stop," he said. "Tell me it's wrong," she said. He looked at her. She waited. "I can explain the structure of what you're looking at," he said. "It's more complicated than— "Is it wrong?" she said. Her voice hadn't changed. That was almost worse than if it had. "Answer that question first, before you explain the structure to me. Is it wrong?" He was quiet. She stepped back. 1 step, just enough to put additional space between them. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is doing something very controlled and precise with the thing happening behind her eyes. "I talked to you," she said, "for hours. About systems. About accountability. About my grandmother." She stopped. Swallowed. Started again with the same careful evenness. "I asked you how businesses made themselves invisible to regulators, and you told me. And you knew the whole time because you—" She stopped again. "You're not an investment guy." "No," he said. "You knew what I was studying. You knew what I wanted to do with my career. You knew all of that, and you sat there and—" "I didn't deceive you about what I thought," he said. "Everything I said to you, I meant." That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. Her voice tightened on the last word, and that was the first time the evenness broke. Just there, just slightly. I'm talking about what you are, what you run. I want to spend my life closing the gaps that let people like you operate. She looked at him, and in her eyes there was something that was not quite anger, because it was still too organized for anger. Do you understand how that feels? To find out that the person I've been talking to is exactly the thing I'm trying to. She stopped, closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. I need to go, she said. Amara, don't. She said it without heat, which was worse than heat. Please don't. I need to think. She walked past him. He didn't reach for her, didn't call after her, because he could hear in the please don't the specific cost at which that word was coming, and he wasn't going to make it cost more than it already did. He stood on the pavement in the cold and watched her go, and he thought about 4 hours in a cafe and the way she'd asked why it feels like you're not all the way here, and the answer he'd told her he couldn't give, and he thought she figured out why. Ryu was already waiting at the car when Ji-hoon arrived. He looked at Ji-hoon's face and said nothing, which was the correct response. Ji-hoon got in. The city moved past the windows. Neon in the early dark, the same neon, the same streets. He was going back to the office that existed on paper as something else, to the work that was what it was, and not what he'd told her it was. And somewhere across this city, a woman who had spent 4 hours arguing with him about accountability was sitting with the specific weight of having found out exactly what she'd put her hand on. He looked at the lights on the Han River as they crossed the bridge. He did not feel nothing. That was the problem. He had not felt nothing for weeks, and now it was too late to go back to the furniture of it, and Park Seung-woo was moving against his territory, and his men expected a response. And he was sitting in the back of a car thinking about a woman who had walked away because she was exactly who she'd told him she was from the first hour. And he was exactly who he was. And those two things were incompatible in a way that no amount of explaining the structure was going to fix. He took out his phone. The last message in their thread was from 2 days ago. She'd sent him a photo of a mistranslated menu item with a single question mark, a small, ordinary thing, the kind of thing people send each other when they've built the habit of small, ordinary communication. He looked at it for a long time in the moving dark of the car. He put the phone away. He had a war beginning on his eastern flank and an empire to manage and decisions to make that had nothing to do with a woman in a green sweater who closed gaps in statutes. He told himself that until he almost believed it. He didn't sleep. Not because of Park Seung-woo's men moving along the eastern docks. That was a problem with solutions, the kind of problem his mind could process cleanly and file under action items. He'd navigated worse territorial disputes at 26 with fewer resources and less leverage, and he'd come out the other side with more ground than he started with. Park was a threat the way bad weather was a threat. Real, requiring preparation, ultimately manageable if you didn't panic. That wasn't what kept him awake. He sat at the desk in his apartment, not the office building, the apartment which was on the 38th floor of a residential tower in Itaewon, and decorated with the sparseness of a man who had never bothered to develop preferences about soft furnishings. And he looked at the Seoul skyline at 3 in the morning, and he thought about her face on the pavement outside Yonsei, the 1 second when she'd closed her eyes, the way the please don't had landed like something structural giving way. He opened his laptop and pulled up a file he kept under an encryption layer that even Ryu didn't have full access to. It was a document he'd started 18 months ago, a restructuring plan, a long horizon strategy for shifting the organization's weight from the things it currently was toward things it could become if the transition were managed correctly. Legitimate holdings, legal enterprises, the kind of infrastructure that could survive scrutiny. He'd been slow-walking it, moving pieces with deliberate patience because you didn't dismantle something the size of what he ran without triggering the exact kind of instability that invited people like Park to test the fences. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he opened a separate window and pulled up Amara's last text. The menu photo. The question mark. He looked at both of them on the screen at the same time. He closed the laptop and went to stand at the window and told himself this was not a decision he was making tonight. 3 days passed. She didn't text. He didn't text. This was reasonable. This was, in fact, the correct outcome of the situation. She had found out something true. She had reacted to it proportionally, and the proportional response from his side was to give her space and not force the issue. He was good at not forcing issues. He had made significant money over the course of his career by understanding when to apply pressure and when to wait. And every instinct he had that was calibrated to business was telling him, wait. His instincts calibrated to other things, less reliable, less exercised, more recently reawakened, were telling him something different, and he was ignoring those. He had a war to manage. Park Seung-woo's people had hit a warehouse in Incheon on the second night. Nothing catastrophic, mostly a message. 2 of Ji-hoon's lower-tier men roughed up and the inventory disrupted, the kind of action designed to draw a response. Ji-hoon had seen this play before. You provoked a response. The response gave you justification for escalation. Escalation gave you cover for the actual move you'd been planning. Park was ambitious and not particularly creative, which made him predictable in broad strokes and dangerous in details. Ji-hoon's lieutenant, a lean and perpetually tense man named Se Jun, who had been with the organization for 7 years and believed deeply in the principle of immediate and overwhelming retaliation, appeared in his office on the 4th morning looking like a man who had been holding something back and had reached his limit. The men are asking questions, Oh said. Ji-hoon was reading a contract. He didn't look up. Let them ask. Boss, Park's people hit the Incheon warehouse. That's not a random choice. Incheon is symbolic. He's saying he can reach our port operations. I know what he's saying. Then we need to respond. If we don't respond in the next 48 hours, every mid-level outfit in the city is going to read that as a signal. Park knows that. He's counting on it. Ji-hoon set down the contract. He looked at Se Jun, who had the particular wound-tight posture of a man who had already decided what the correct answer was and was waiting for permission to execute it. What do you want to do? Ji-hoon asked. His distribution hub on the north side of Mapo. We hit it hard, we make sure the message is clear and unambiguous. 2 nights from now, while his senior people are at... No, Ji-hoon said. Stared at him. Boss, I said no. If you don't respond to this, Park is going to interpret that as... Oh, Ji-hoon said it quietly. I understand the logic. I've been running this organization since before you joined it. I understand exactly what the silence reads as from the outside, and I'm telling you, not the warehouse. Not yet. O's jaw tightened. He had a good jaw for tightening, angular, expressive, and a face that tried to be controlled. Then what? We just absorb it? We wait, Ji-hoon said, and we watch. Park made a move. Before I respond to the move he made, I want to know what move he actually wants me to make, because this wasn't about the warehouse. O was quiet for a moment. You think he's drawing you somewhere specific? I think he's drawing me somewhere. Yes. Ji-hoon picked up the contract again. Give the Incheon men a bonus and tell them it's from me personally. Make sure Park hears about the bonus. Let him wonder what I'm thinking. Oh, left. Ji-hoon set the contract back down immediately and stared at the wall. He was thinking about the restructuring document. He was thinking about the fact that everything he'd told Amara about himself, not the facts he'd withheld, but the actual shape of who he was in those conversations, had been true, and that the things he'd withheld were also true, and that truth was not a simple substance. It came in layers and textures, and some of it was load-bearing, and some of it was insulation, and the problem was that she'd found a load-bearing piece and pulled it. His phone was in his pocket, and he did not take it out. She texted on the 5th day. Not warmth, not hostility. Precision, which was characteristic. I've been thinking. I don't want to have a conversation by text. Can we meet? He looked at the message for longer than it warranted. Then he typed, yes, when? She named a time and a place. Not the first cafe, not the one with the sticky tables. A park, Bukhansan, the flat area near the southern entrance where people walked dogs, and the noise of the city didn't quite reach. Public, open, not a place that implied anything about the nature of the meeting. She was managing it. Of course she was. He arrived 7 minutes early and waited. Sat. She arrived exactly on time, which he was beginning to understand was a thing she did. Not early enough to look eager, not late enough to make a statement. She was wearing a heavy coat, the October air having committed now to actual cold, and her hair was loose and the wind was doing something with it she was periodically correcting with an impatient hand. She didn't greet him. She fell into step beside him, and they walked for a full minute in silence while a woman with a Shiba Inu passed in the opposite direction. Then Amara said, "I spent 2 days angry." "Okay," he said. "Then I spent 2 days trying to be fair, which I hate, by the way. Fairness is something I have to work at. I'd rather just be angry." "I know." She glanced at him sideways. "You know that about me? You told me. First night. You said most good reasons were specific. You said your grandmother. You're not a person who deals in abstractions, which means anger specific to a cause, not ambient anger." She was quiet for a moment, walking. "You were still dishonest with me," she said. "Yes." "Not by saying things that weren't true, by not saying things that were." "Yes. I want you to understand that I know the difference, and I'm not letting you off the hook for it. Omission is a choice. You chose repeatedly to let me think you were someone you're not." "I chose," he said, "to let you meet the part of me that was talking to you, which was real." He paused. "I'm not arguing that was the right choice." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They were standing near a low stone wall, the city visible beyond a gap in the tree line, smudged with morning haze. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I need to understand that. Not theoretically, what do you actually want?" He looked at her. He thought about this for longer than a comfortable pause allowed, but she let him think, which was one of the things she did that most people didn't. She gave thoughts the time they needed, rather than filling the space. "I don't know how to answer that without it sounding like a manipulation," he said, "which is a problem, because the answer is true. Try. I want to keep talking to you." He held her gaze. "That's what I want. I'm not trying to use you. I'm not trying to manage you. I've spent 4 years not wanting to talk to anyone in particular, and you changed that, and I didn't plan for it, and I don't have a clean way to package it." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the trees above them. "Do you understand what I'm training to do?" she said. "Yes." "Do you understand that if I ever become the lawyer I'm trying to become, and I find evidence of what you run, I will use it? That I could not make an exception for you personally?" "Yes," he said. "I know that. And you're still here. And I'm still here." She exhaled, and it showed in the cold air, a brief cloud of breath dissolving. She looked away from him toward the city. "I don't know what to do with you," she said, which was not something she said with warmth exactly, more like a problem being named accurately. "Neither do I," he said, "but I think that's honest." She almost laughed. Didn't quite. "I'm not agreeing to anything," she said. "I'm not saying things are fine. I'm saying I think you were real with me in the ways that mattered, and I'm not able to just erase that, which doesn't mean I'm not still angry. I know. And you can't keep things from me again. If this continues in any form, I'd rather know the truth about you than a version that's safer for you." He was quiet. "Can you do that?" she asked. He thought about the restructuring document. He thought about Se Jun and the Incheon warehouse, and Park Seung-woo testing the fences. He thought about everything he was, and everything that knowing everything he was would cost her. "I can do more of it," he said, "immediately and completely. I don't know, but more." She studied him. She was doing the assessment again, the one she did with legal documents, checking the argument against the available evidence. "More," she said. "Okay, more is somewhere to start." They started walking again, and this time the silence was different. Over the following 2 weeks, Ji-hoon began doing something he had no template for, telling the truth in increments. Not all of it. Not the operational details, not the names, not the specifics that would make her a liability. He drew lines, carefully, around what he said. But the shape of the thing, the architecture of how it worked and what it required and what it had cost, he let her see more of that. Not in single confessional conversations, but in small pieces, accumulated over coffee and texts in one long evening when she was stuck waiting for a delayed assignment to be graded, and they sat in her apartment building's lobby and talked for 3 hours because she didn't want to be alone with her thesis anxiety, and didn't say that, but he could tell. She asked questions that landed exactly where they were aimed. She asked whether he'd ever wanted out. He said yes, and that wanting out and having a viable path out were different categories. She asked when the viable path had started to seem possible. He was quiet for a while. He said recently. She looked at him like she understood what recently meant, and she didn't press it, but she filed it. She asked once whether he had people hurt. He looked at her. He said, "In the past, yes." She held his gaze and something moved through her face that was complex and cost her something, and she said, "I figured." And she didn't look away, and she didn't pretend it was fine, and she also didn't leave. And that was one of the most difficult things he'd ever sat with because he didn't know what to do with being seen clearly by someone who stayed. Meanwhile, Park Seung-woo was not patient. The second incident came on a Thursday night. Not a warehouse this time, but a car. One of Ji-hoon's mid-level men, a man named Baek, who ran a cleaning operation in Mapo, found his car with its windows smashed and a single photograph left on the driver's seat. The photograph was of Baek's daughter walking home from school. Oh, Se Jun was in Ji-hoon's office inside 40 minutes. "This is different," Oh said. His voice had gone flat, which for Oh was the equivalent of shouting. "This is personal targeting. This is families." Ji-hoon looked at the photo. He kept his face still. "Where's Baek?" "With his family. He's scared, boss. That's the point. Park wants our people scared. He wants them asking questions about whether you can protect them." Ji-hoon set the photo down. He thought about it. The calculation behind the move, the specific choice of target. Baek was mid-level, not strategic. His removal would not materially harm the organization. But Baek had a daughter who walked home from school, and Park had chosen this particular piece of information to deliver. And the message was not about Baek. The message was about what Park was willing to use. "Who else knows about this?" Ji-hoon said. "Me, you, the two men who found Baek after. Keep it contained. I don't want this spreading through the organization." He stood up. "Double security on Baek's family tonight, quietly. No announcement, no statement to the men about what happened." "Boss, if the men don't see a response, the men will see a response when I'm ready to give one." Ji-hoon looked at Oh. "Park just showed me something. I want to think about what it means before I answer it." Oh's jaw was doing the thing again. "How long do we wait?" "Until I know what he actually wants." Oh left. Ji-hoon stood at the window and breathed and thought about a daughter walking home from school and a photograph left on a front seat. And he thought about what kind of man made that move, and he thought about what kind of man he was willing to be in response to it. He thought about Amara asking, "Do you understand what I'm training to do?" He took out his phone. He typed, "Can you talk?" She replied in 3 minutes. "Give me 20. They talked for an hour and a half. Not about Park, not about any of it. She talked about a paper she was writing on corporate liability in international jurisdictions, and he listened, and at one point she said something that made him actually laugh. A real one, short and unguarded, and she paused and said, "Was that a laugh?" And he said, "Apparently." And she said, "Good, I was starting to think you didn't." After he hung up, he sat in his office, and the silence came back in a different shape than it had before. Heavier and more specific, and he thought, this cannot coexist. These two things cannot coexist inside one life. Something will give. He just hadn't decided yet which thing he was willing to let it be. The decision was made for him 11 days later. He was in a meeting at a hotel in Gangnam. Legitimate meeting. One of the legal side architects of the restructuring plan, a lawyer named Kim, who knew enough of the picture to be useful and not enough to be dangerous. They were discussing timeline and liability architecture when Ryu stepped into the room, which Ryu never did during meetings, and stood at the door with an expression that Ji-hoon had learned over 11 years meant now. Ji-hoon excused himself. In the corridor, Ryu said quietly, "Park's people have been asking questions about you, specifically about your activities in the last 2 months, where you've been, who you've been seen with." Ji-hoon went still. "They've been talking to people in Sinchon," Ryu continued, "the cafe district, asking staff about a man matching your description, who he met with, how often." Ji-hoon said nothing. "Boss," Ryu's voice was careful, "if Park is running reconnaissance on your personal movements, he's not just looking at the business, he's looking for leverage, personal leverage." He paused. "The foreign student—" "Stop," Ji-hoon said. Ryu stopped. Ji-hoon stood in the corridor of a hotel in Gangnam and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The specific cold clarity of a threat that was not abstract. Not the organization, not the business, not the infrastructure. Something he hadn't had before. Something that could be reached. She doesn't know, he thought. She doesn't know she's visible. She doesn't know that being seen with him has made her part of the picture. He thought about a photograph of a daughter walking home from school. He thought about Amara moving through the Yonsei campus in her green sweater, argumentative and unhurried, closing gaps in statutes, completely unaware that someone was probably noting what time she left the building and which route she took. He thought about the restructuring document and the timeline and the careful, slow architecture of a transition that he'd been building like an engineer in the dark, patient and methodical. And he thought, there is no more time for patience. He walked back into the meeting room, told Kim they were done for the day, and had Ryu drive him to the office in silence. In the car, he sat with his hands flat on his thighs and watched the Gangnam streets move past the window, and did the arithmetic of the situation with the cold efficiency of a man who had learned to do that arithmetic young and had never stopped. Park knew about Amara. Maybe not her name yet, maybe not the details, but Park knew there was a person. Park was the kind of man who, once he identified a pressure point, applied pressure to it, not out of cruelty specifically, but out of methodology. You found what someone valued, and you made them choose between it and whatever you wanted from them. It was the oldest move in the book, and it worked because most people, when pushed, chose the thing they valued. Ji-hoon had never had anything Park could use that way. Until now. He called Ryu into his office the moment they arrived. I need eyes on her, he said. Discreet. She doesn't know. She can't know. I need to know if anyone is watching her, where they're positioned, how long they've been there. Ryu nodded. No questions. This was one of Ryu's values. He understood which questions were operational and which were personal, and he had enough respect for the line between them to stay on the right side. Also, Ji-hoon said, I want everything we have on Park's current operations, not summaries, the actual data. Every holding, every front company, every piece of leverage he's accumulated in the last 18 months. You're going to move against him. I'm going to understand him. There's a difference. Ryu left. Ji-hoon sat behind his desk and opened the restructuring document and looked at it for a long time. The timeline, the architecture, the careful, patient scaffolding of a transition that was supposed to take another year, maybe 2. And he thought about a photograph of a child on a car seat, and he thought about Amara walking across the Yonsei campus, without knowing she'd become part of someone's reconnaissance file. He closed the document. He picked up his phone. He did not call her because calling her now, with what he knew, would mean lying by omission again. And he had told her more and she had asked for more, and he was not going to do that to her again. But he needed to know she was where she was supposed to be, so he texted, How's the liability paper going? She replied in 4 minutes, slowly. My professor keeps moving the goalposts. I think she enjoys watching us suffer. He looked at the message. He typed, Sounds like someone I'd respect. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and called Se Jun, Amakish Mincham. Arrived inside 20 minutes, which meant he'd been close, which meant he'd been anticipating the call. He sat across from Ji-hoon with the posture of a man who has been waiting to be given permission to act and is almost vibrating with the restraint of not having it yet. Tell me what we know about Park's inner circle, Ji-hoon said. Oh's eyes sharpened. His top lieutenant is a man named Cheon, runs the day-to-day, personally loyal to Park. They go back 15 years, came up together out of a gang in Daejeon. Second tier is mostly younger men, ambitious, less attached. Park runs a tight ship in terms of information. He doesn't let his people know more than they need to for their specific function. Oh paused. Which means Cheon knows everything, and Cheon is the access point. Where does Cheon have exposure? Oh looked at him steadily. His younger brother has a restaurant in Mapo, does about 30% legitimate business, and floats the rest on Park's money. It's clean on the surface, but the books would not survive a serious audit. That's not what I'm asking. I know. Oh leaned forward slightly. Cheon has a gambling problem he's been managing badly for 3 years. He owes money to a private lender in Busan who is not affiliated with Park and does not know who Cheon works for. The debt is substantial. Ji-hoon was quiet. How substantial? Enough that it's been causing him sleep problems. And Park doesn't know. Park definitely does not know. Cheon has been hiding it because Park has a specific intolerance for what he calls personal disorder in his people. He would view it as a security risk. Ji-hoon thought about this. He thought about pressure points and the arithmetic of leverage. And he thought about the fact that he was sitting here doing exactly what he'd been doing for 15 years, looking for the seam in someone's life where a blade would fit. And something in him was tired of the familiarity of it in a way he hadn't been tired of it before. I'm not going to use it to hurt him, Ji-hoon said. I want to use it to get a meeting with Park. Private. No entourage, no staging, just him and me in a room. Oh looked at him like he'd said something in a language he didn't quite speak. You want to meet with Park. I want to end this without a war. Boss, I know what you're going to say. With respect, I don't think you do. Because what I'm going to say is that Park does not end things without wars. It is not in his operating vocabulary. If you go to him privately and make an offer, he will read that as confirmation that you're weakened, and he will... Oh, Ji-hoon said it quietly. I understand the risk. Arrange the meeting through Cheon. Don't tell anyone else. Oh stood. He had the expression of a man who was executing an order he disagreed with and had decided to disagree with it silently, which was the most insubordination Ji-hoon allowed and which Oh knew precisely. He left. Ji-hoon sat alone. He thought, one meeting, one conversation where the terms were clear and the choice was real. He would tell Park what was coming, the restructuring, the legitimization, the handing of certain operational keys to people who were not Ji-hoon's problem anymore. And he would make clear that what Park stood to gain by cooperation was more valuable than what he stood to take by force. It was a reasonable argument. It was even, in a certain light, generous. He knew it might not work. He went ahead with it anyway. The meeting was arranged in 4 days. A restaurant in Mapo that Cheon's brother owned after closing, stripped of staff. Ji-hoon arrived with Ryu and 2 other men and told them to wait outside. He went in alone. Park Seong-woo was already there. He was a smaller man than Ji-hoon had expected, which was a thing Ji-hoon noted with a kind of dark internal humor. The most dangerous people rarely announced their dimensions with their bodies. Park was compact, somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from controlled energy. A man whose resting state was coiled readiness. He had a scar through one eyebrow that pulled his expression slightly crooked. He was sitting at the center table with a glass of water in front of him and no one else in the room. He looked at Ji-hoon the way a man looks at something he's been studying from a distance and is now seen up close for the first time. Kang Ji-hoon, he said. Sit down. Ji-hoon sat. I heard you wanted a conversation, Park said. I was curious enough to come. I want to tell you where things are going, Ji-hoon said, before they go there, so you can make a decision with full information. That's considerate. Park's tone held something dry and watchful. Tell me. Ji-hoon laid it out. Clean, direct, no performance. The restructuring, the timeline, the scope, the transition of operational control, the shift toward legitimate enterprise. The parts of the territory that would be vacated and could be absorbed by whoever was positioned to absorb them. The parts that would be handed to legal structures. He kept it factual, kept his voice level, and when he finished, he looked at Park and waited. Park had not moved during any of it. He had the listening quality of someone who was not just hearing words, but was also running a separate and parallel process on everything the words might mean. You're walking away, Park said finally. I'm changing the nature of what I'm doing. Yes. And you want me to... what? Wait politely while you complete your transition? I want to offer you the Eastern Distribution Network as a gesture of good faith, as compensation for the inconvenience of the transition period. Park looked at him. Something moved through his face that Ji-hoon couldn't entirely read. Amusement maybe, or something colder than amusement that wore amusement as a coat. The Eastern Network, Park said. It's worth... I know what it's worth. Park picked up his water glass, looked at it, set it back down. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. What changed? Ji-hoon looked at him. I've been watching you for 3 years, Park said, waiting for the moment when the right move became available. And for 3 years you were exactly what you've always been. Precise, cold, completely uninterested in anything that wasn't the organization. And then 4 months ago, something shifted. He tilted his head. I had people try to identify it. We found some of it. The Se Jun activity. He paused. The girl. Se Jun kept his face still. International student, Park said. Georgetown Law. Very smart, by all accounts. Very principled. Something in his voice on the last word was careful in a way that was not care. I find it interesting that a man like you would let something like that alter his strategic judgment. My strategic judgment, Se Jun said, is what's in front of you. The offer stands. It's good business for you. It might be, Park said. He looked at Se Jun for a long moment. I'll tell you what concerns me, though. What concerns me is that you've made a transition plan that's contingent on everything staying stable long enough for you to execute it. And the person who most threatens that stability is me. He spread his hand slightly. So this offer, it's not really generosity, is it? It's insurance. Most good offers are both. Park was quiet. Then, I need to think about it. Se Jun stood. You have a week. He walked out of the restaurant into the cold Mapo night and got in the car, and Ryu looked at him and Se Jun said, We wait. He should have known by how easily Park had agreed to the meeting. He understood it 6 days later at 10 in the morning when Se Jun walked into his office with an expression that was not O's usual wound-tight readiness, but something different, something that had the quality of a man about to deliver information he didn't want to deliver. What? Se Jun said. Put a file on the desk. A thin file, 3 pages, with photographs attached. Se Jun opened it. The first page was a transaction record. Money moving through a series of accounts over the past 14 months. The money was traceable, barely, but traceable if you knew where to look. Se Jun looked at the destination accounts and felt something very cold begin at the base of his skull. The accounts belonged to a holding company that belonged, on the 4th layer, to a man named Kim Sung-hyun. Kim Sung-hyun was his lawyer, his restructuring architect, the man he'd been meeting with in the Gangnam Hotel when Ryu had stepped in to tell him about Park's reconnaissance. Se Jun looked at the second page. More transactions. Earlier. Going back almost 2 years. When did you find this? Se Jun said. His voice came out flat, which was not a choice, just what happened when the space where response was supposed to be was occupied by something too large for expression. Last night, O said. I've been running a parallel audit of all the restructuring contacts for the past week. Since the Park meeting, I wanted to make sure our exposure was contained. And you found Kim. Kim has been on Park's payroll for 22 months. O said it carefully, like each word was a piece of glass he was setting down. Everything you told Kim about the restructuring, the timeline, the asset positions, the legal architecture, Park has had it, probably within 48 hours of each meeting. Se Jun looked at the photographs on the 3rd page. Kim and Park's man Cheon, a restaurant in Apgujeong, 3 months ago. The surveillance quality was good. You could see Kim's face clearly. He was smiling. Se Jun closed the file. He sat very still. He thought about the meeting with Park, the way Park had listened without surprise. The way he'd said, I've been watching you for 3 years, with the particular confidence of someone who had been watching from a much shorter distance than that. The way he'd said the timeline and the scope, and the transition of operational control back to Se Jun as a paraphrase, barely altered the exact language from the restructuring document. Park had known everything. He had come to the meeting already knowing everything. And he had said, I need to think about it. And he had not attacked. And he had not taken the offer. And Se Jun had walked out thinking he had bought time. He had bought nothing. Park had simply been deciding which move to make next, with complete information, while Se Jun operated on a version of the picture that had a significant piece missing. Boss, O said, I heard you. We need to move. If Park has had the full restructuring plan for 22 months, he knows which assets are in transition, which operations are understaffed right now, which I know what it means. Se Jun stood up. He walked to the window. Below him, Seoul was doing its ordinary morning, traffic and pedestrians and a delivery truck blocking a lane on the corner, ordinary and indifferent. Where's Kim now? His office. He doesn't know we know. Keep it that way. For how long? Se Jun didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the architecture of the situation, the restructuring plan now compromised, The legal framework built on documents that Park had access to. The transition timeline which Park could disrupt at any point of his choosing. 2 years of careful building. The slow, patient work of trying to make an exit that didn't destroy everything it touched. And it had been seen, measured, and used as a map by exactly the person it was supposed to outmaneuver. He thought about what it meant that Park had chosen this moment. The meeting, the deliberate patience of letting Se Jun make his offer. And understood. Park wasn't going to accept the offer. Park had never been going to accept the offer. The meeting had been intelligence collection. Park wanted to know if Se Jun was serious about the transition, and he was now satisfied that Se Jun was, and that meant the transition was the threat. A legitimate Se Jun with clean hands and a cooperating legal system was a much more dangerous long-term adversary than a criminal Se Jun who played by the same rules as Park. Park was going to kill the restructuring. Not Se Jun, not yet. Too much noise. But the plan itself, the legal architecture, the clean hands. He would expose it selectively, feed information to the right authorities at the right time, and Se Jun would spend the next 3 years fighting criminal investigations instead of completing a transition. Unless Se Jun moved first, unless he didn't fight from the shadows. The thought arrived not as a plan but as a shape. The rough outline of something he'd been circling for months without being able to see it whole. He stood at the window and let it take form, and what it formed into was not what he would have chosen, was in fact the last thing he would have chosen 3 months ago. But 3 months ago he hadn't been the same person in the same situation. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Amara. A text. Finished the liability paper. My professor is going to either love it or fail me. No in between. He stared at the text for a long moment. He typed, I need to see you tonight. It's important. She replied, You okay? He looked at the word okay and thought about what an inadequate instrument it was for the current situation. He typed, Not entirely. Can you come to Itaewon? I'll explain when you're here. She replied, Give me 2 hours. He put the phone in his pocket and turned to Se Jun, who was still standing in the same spot, watching him with the expression of a man who has delivered bad news and is waiting to find out what it costs. I need you to set something up, Se Jun said. Not a meeting, a press conference. Stared at him. I'm going to make a statement, Se Jun said. Public. On the record. Everything. The restructuring, the transition, the scope of the legal compliance process. All of it. On camera. In my name. The silence in the room had a texture to it. You're going to expose yourself, said slowly, like he was translating from a foreign language. Voluntarily. I'm going to remove Park's weapon before he can use it, Se Jun said. If the transition is public and on record, he can't use it as leverage. He can't selectively feed it to authorities because there's nothing selective about it. It's already there. The only play he has left is a direct move against me, and a direct move against me in that context. He stopped. Get me a lawyer. Not Kim, someone clean, someone I have no prior association with, and get me a media contact. Looked at him for a long time. Something moved through the lieutenant's face that was complicated. Not quite fear, not quite admiration, something that had both in it. Boss, he said, if you do this, there's no taking it back. I know. Everything you've built, the way things work, the way people see you, all of it changes. I know that too. Nodded once, the slow nod of a man committing to something he didn't choose. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, without turning around, I think you've been trying to get here for a long time. He left. Se Jun stood alone in his office. He looked at the restructuring document on his screen. 2 years of architecture, careful and patient, and now irrevocably compromised. And he thought about Amara asking, Do you understand what I'm training to do? And he thought about what it would mean to stand in front of a camera and say his name and say what he ran and say what he was choosing to do instead. And he thought about every version of himself that had existed before this moment. And he thought about the man he was going to have to become to survive what came next. Amara arrived at 7:43. He heard the elevator, then her knock. 3 short raps. Unhurried, her knock exactly. And he crossed the apartment and opened the door, and she looked at his face, and her expression shifted immediately from the careful neutral she'd worn since Yonsei into something more direct. What happened? She said. Not a question. He stepped back and let her in. She came in and stood in the center of the apartment's main room and looked at him. She was wearing the heavy coat, her hair pinned up, and she had her laptop bag over one shoulder because she'd probably come from the library, and she looked warm and real and entirely incompatible with everything that was currently happening in his life. And he stood 6 feet away from her and thought, I have to tell her what I'm about to do before she reads it somewhere else. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. You're scaring me. I'm not trying to scare you. I know you're not trying to. You're doing it anyway. What happened? He told her. Not all of it. Not Kim's name, not the operational specifics, not the details that would make her a witness to things she shouldn't witness, but the shape, the betrayal, the compromise plan, what Park now held, and what he intended to do with it. And then the response he'd decided on. She listened without interrupting, which was not her default, which meant she understood that what he was saying required the full space. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. A press conference, she said. Yes. You're going to stand in front of cameras and put your name on all of it. Yes. Voluntarily. That's what I said. She looked at him. He could see her processing it, not just what it meant for the legal architecture, which her training would walk her through automatically, but what it meant about him, what it meant that he was standing in his apartment telling her this before he told almost anyone else. Do you understand what this does to you? She said. Legally. There will be investigations, there will be... I know. It won't protect you from everything. Voluntary disclosure has limits. I have lawyers. Ji-hoon. She said his name with a weight that stopped him. I'm not talking about strategy right now. I'm asking if you understand what you're choosing to lose. He looked at her. I understand, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her face that was too complex to name quickly. She was doing the thing she did, following the shape of the thing to where it actually led, and where it led was somewhere that cost her something to look at directly. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. That's all? What do you want me to say? She set her bag down, slowly. You're doing the right thing. You know you're doing the right thing. You don't need me to tell you. She paused. I'm scared for you. Don't be scared for me. That's not a thing you get to decide. He almost said something. Didn't. She was right, and he knew she was right, and this was not the moment to argue about it. He looked at her standing in the center of his apartment, her coat still on, and he thought, she came. 2 hours, she said, and she came, and she's standing here while he told her the worst of it, and she said, okay. And she said, I'm scared for you, and she had not run. And he didn't have language for what to do with that except to stand in it. The conference is tomorrow morning, he said, 9 o'clock. She nodded. I'll be watching. You don't have to. I'll be watching, she said again, the same quiet firmness. That's not negotiable. He didn't sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. Not the restless, calculating dark of a problem without solutions, but the flat, clear wakefulness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for morning to arrive so the decision can become real. He sat at the desk and reviewed the statement 3 times, and changed 2 words and then changed them back. And at 4 in the morning, he stood at the window and watched the Han River catch the pre-dawn light and thought, after tomorrow, nothing is the same shape. He thought about Se Jun's voice. I think you've been trying to get here for a long time. He thought about being 12 years old and wanting to build parks. He thought about Amara saying, you still see like an architect. At 6, he showered and dressed, and by 7:30 he was in the building that his new lawyer, a woman named Jung, competent and unintimidated, who had asked him 3 precise questions and then stopped asking questions and started building, had selected for the statement. A conference room, spare and clean, with the Seoul skyline visible through tall windows, cameras from 4 outlets, 2 print journalists, 1 photographer. Ryu was positioned at the door. Oh was somewhere in the building, Ji-hoon knew, because Oh would not stay away from this even though Ji-hoon hadn't asked him to come. The men of the organization were waiting because word had traveled the way word always traveled, and they were waiting to understand what this meant for them. Ji-hoon stood behind the table and looked at the cameras and felt the weight of the room. He thought, 10 years ago I would not have been able to do this. 5 years ago. Even 1 year ago. He thought, She asked me what I wanted, and I said I wanted to keep talking to her, and that was true. But the fuller truth was that she'd cracked something open that had been sealed for so long he'd forgotten it was sealed. And what came out was not something new. It was the 12-year-old who wanted to build parks. It was the version of him that had believed, before the education, that structures could exist for everyone. He thought, this is not for her. She would hate it if she thought it was for her. This is for the version of himself that he'd been carrying around like a photograph of someone he used to know. He sat down. The cameras started. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not perform it. He said his name, said what his organization had been, said what it was going to become. And he said it in the flat, deliberate voice of a man making a legal record, not a confession, not a narrative of redemption, just a factual accounting of what was true and what was changing and why. He named assets. He named legal entities. He named the transition framework and the compliance architecture and the timeline. He did not name individuals who had not chosen to be named, and he did not editorialize, and he did not look at the cameras like a man seeking something from them. When he finished, the room was very quiet for 3 full seconds. Then it was not quiet at all. Park saw it live. Ji-hoon knew this because Cheon called Oh within the hour, and the call was 3 seconds long. Just Cheon's voice, flat, with something that might have been shock or might have been recalibration, saying, "Tell your boss he has made a very serious mistake." Oh relayed this to Ji-hoon without commentary. Ji-hoon said, "Now we find out what he does with it." What Park did was move fast. By noon, the eastern docks were hit. Not the subtle message sending of the Incheon warehouse, but a direct operational assault. 2 storage facilities, 6 men hospitalized. By 2 in the afternoon, Ji-hoon's phone was receiving calls from mid-level operators across the network, men who had watched the press conference and were now watching the dock footage, and were doing the arithmetic of whether their safety was still guaranteed. Oh was in the war room, a back office in a building in Mapo that served as operational HQ, when Ji-hoon arrived, surrounded by 4 senior men and a table of communications equipment and the particular atmosphere of people who have realized that a crisis is no longer theoretical. "He's moving on everything at once," Oh said without preamble. "Eastern docks, the Sinchon distribution, he's got people positioned near 3 of the legal transition assets. He's trying to hit before the press conference generates legal protection." How long does he have before the authorities start paying attention to the conference? Legal filed the compliance notification this morning, probably 12 to 18 hours before anyone official starts making calls. Park knows that timeline. Yes. Ji-hoon looked at the map spread on the table. He saw the positions, the pressure points, the geometry of the assault. Park was not being subtle because subtlety was no longer useful. The press conference had changed the tactical landscape, which meant Park needed to do maximum damage in minimum time before the window closed. "He's going to go for the physical assets," Ji-hoon said. "Destroying legal paperwork and transition documents does more damage than hitting the docks. He wants to set back the compliance timeline, make it look unstable, give himself room to—" He stopped. His phone was vibrating in his pocket. He took it out. "Ryu." He answered. "Boss?" Ryu's voice had a texture in it that Ji-hoon had heard exactly twice before in 11 years, and both times it had preceded very bad information. "We have a problem that is not the docks." Ji-hoon went still. "Tell me." "Park's people have been following her since this morning, since before the conference. I had a man watching, like you asked. They moved to active surveillance 2 hours ago. They're not watching anymore. They're positioned." The blood in Ji-hoon's hands went cold. "Where is she?" he said. "Library, Yonsei campus. She's been there since 9. My man says she has 2 people outside the building and 1 inside." "How close is my man to the building?" 30 meters. "Tell him not to move. Don't do anything that tips them. I'm coming." He was already moving, already across the room, turning to watch him with an expression that was catching up to the situation. "How many men do I have available right now that are not tied up at the Eastern assets?" 6, Ryu said. 7 including me. "I need 4 at Yonsei in the next 20 minutes. Quiet. No confrontation until I say." "Boss, now, Ryu." He disconnected. Oh was at his shoulder. "Park's got people on her," Oh said. He'd heard enough. "Yes. This is leverage. He's not going to hurt her. Not yet. He's going to use her as I know what he's going to use her as. Ji-hoon grabbed his jacket. Stay here. Manage the dock situation. Don't escalate, don't retaliate. Hold the line until I'm back. Ji-hoon! Oh used his name, not the title, which he almost never did. Ji-hoon stopped. Oh looked at him with something that was stripped of the professional distance for once, something that was just two people in a room. If you go in there personally, you're confirming to Park exactly what she means to you. He will use that for as long as you let him. I know. So you know that the move that protects her and closes the leverage is... I know what the move is, Ji-hoon said. I'm not making that move. He walked out. The car ran 3 lights. Ryu drove. Ji-hoon sat in the back with his phone in his hand and did not look at it because looking at it would mean deciding whether to call her, and if he called her, she would understand something was wrong and she would do something characteristic of her. She would walk toward the problem rather than away from it, because that was who she was, and he could not afford for her to be who she was for the next 30 minutes. He thought about her at the library, probably with her laptop open, probably still running her 3 parallel thought commentary on whatever she was reading, probably arguing with the text in the margins of her notes, completely unaware that 2 people were positioned outside the building, watching the entrance, and one was inside, and the one inside would be watching her specifically and waiting for a signal. He thought about a photograph of a child on a car seat. He thought about Park in the restaurant, compact and coiled, saying, I find it interesting that a man like you would let something like that alter his strategic judgment. He thought, this is my fault. The visibility was mine to manage, and I did not manage it early enough, and now she is sitting in a library inside someone else's calculation. The car pulled up 2 blocks from the Yonsei campus. Ji-hoon got out. Ryu fell into step beside him and said nothing, which was correct. 2 of the 4 men he'd called were already in position. He could see them without looking at them. The way you learn to see without looking. The peripheral awareness of the trained. The other 2 were coming from the north side. He texted Ryu's contact. Where? The response came back in 40 seconds. East entrance. 3rd floor reading room. Window seat. Park's man is in the stacks 3 rows back, has sightline. Ji-hoon typed. The 2 outside. Positions. Response. Pavement across the street. Parked car. Second one, southeast corner of the building, standing, coffee cup, not drinking it. He looked at the campus entrance. He could see the parked car from here, and after a moment he could see the man on the southeast corner, and the quality of the man's stillness was readable. It was the stillness of someone waiting for instructions, not the stillness of someone reading messages on their phone. That man had his attention allocated elsewhere. He was watching the east entrance. Ji-hoon thought about the geometry of the next 10 minutes. If he walked in, Park's man inside would see him and make the call, and the 2 outside would close. That was a confrontation with 6 people minimum on a university campus, with students and staff, and a legal situation that was already live and documented. And a confrontation here would destroy in 20 minutes everything the press conference had started building. If he sent his men in and pulled her out without going himself, there was a chance she didn't understand what was happening fast enough to cooperate, and a chance Park's man escalated before the withdrawal was clean. If he called her. He stopped walking. He called her. It rang twice. Hey, she said, and her voice was her ordinary voice, the slightly distracted voice of someone mid-thought, and the ordinariness of it hit him somewhere between the ribs. What's... Listen to me, he said. Don't react. Don't change your expression. Don't look around. A beat of silence. He heard her breathe. Okay, she said. Quiet. Controlled. The evenness she pulled from somewhere when things cost the most. There is a man 3 rows behind you in the stacks. He is watching you. He works for someone who wants to use you to get to me. I need you to close your laptop, put your things in your bag normally, and walk to the women's bathroom on the 2nd floor. Go now. Move normally, like you're just going to the bathroom. Another beat. He heard Paige's turn nearby. She was doing it, making the motion normal. There are people outside the building, she said. Very quiet. Barely moving her lips, he could tell. Aren't there? Yes. How many? 2 outside, 1 inside. Your people? 4, plus Ryu. He heard the soft zip of her bag closing. Ji-hoon. Her voice was so controlled it hurt to hear. Did this happen because of this morning? The press conference? It would have happened regardless. He had your location before the conference. She made a sound that was very small and very compressed, the sound of someone absorbing something they hadn't expected to have to absorb. Bathroom, he said. Second floor. My man will meet you at the door. Don't go anywhere with him until he says the word careful. That's the confirmation. Careful, she repeated. Yes, go. He heard her stand, heard the ambient noise of the reading room, heard her steps, and then he was moving himself because standing still was no longer something his body would cooperate with. The next 8 minutes were the longest 8 minutes he could remember in years. Longer than the first time someone had pulled a weapon on him, longer than the night his mother's building lost heat in February, and he spent 6 hours on the phone trying to find the building owner. Longer than the night he understood what his father was and what it meant for what he would become. Those had been long minutes. These were different because the variable he couldn't control was not his own safety, and he had forgotten, until now, how much harder that was. His earpiece crackled. Ryu, she's in the bathroom. Kim is with her. He exhaled. Park's man in the stacks is still there, Ryu continued. He doesn't know yet. He thinks she's in the bathroom normally. We have maybe 4 minutes before he moves to check. The two outside. Waiting, no movement. I want her out the north exit. Service corridor, maintenance door. Tell Kim. Done. A pause. Boss, Park's man is going to know when he checks the stacks. He's going to call it in. When he does, the two outside, they'll come to you, Se Jun said. That's fine. I want them coming to you. He looked at the southeast corner where the man with the coffee cup was standing, still watching the east entrance. And he thought about what came next, and he thought about, Se Jun saying, if you go in there personally, you're confirming to Park exactly what she means to you. He already knew that Park knew what she meant to him. There was no confirmation left to protect. He said into the earpiece, get her to the car, the gray car, north side. I'll be there in 6 minutes. If I'm not there in 6 minutes, Ryu, you take her somewhere safe and you don't stop for anything. Where are you going? Se Jun looked at the southeast corner. I'm going to have a conversation, he said. He walked toward the corner. The man with the coffee cup saw him coming from about 15 meters, and for a fraction of a second his body did the thing bodies do when training an instinct clash. The coffee cup held still, the shoulders shifted, the weight moved fractionally toward the back foot. He was recalculating whether to make the call, whether this was the move, whether Se Jun walking toward him in broad daylight on a university campus was part of a plan or a mistake. Se Jun stopped 2 meters away. Call Park, he said. His voice was quiet and completely level. Tell him the girl is out. Tell him the next time he points something at her is the last time he points something at anything. He looked at the man, who had the young flat face of someone doing a job and beginning to understand the job had more dimensions than the briefing covered. Tell him I said that myself, personally. The man said nothing. Se Jun turned and walked north. Behind him, he heard the coffee cup hit the pavement. Chote. She was in the gray car when he got there, 3 minutes and 40 seconds after he'd said 6. And she was sitting in the back seat with her laptop bag on her lap and her hands flat on top of the bag. And she was not crying and she was not shaking. But when he opened the door and got in and Ryu pulled away from the curb immediately, she turned and looked at him and he could see in her face what the control had cost. Are you hurt? He said. No. Then, you knew they were there before you called me. Yes. How long? 20 minutes, approximately. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not anger, but was not its absence either. 20 minutes, she said. I needed to know the positions before I moved. She looked out the window. She was doing the breathing thing, the controlled slow exhale through the nose, the thing she did when she was making herself stay even. He watched her do it and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Where are we going? She said finally. Somewhere safe. I'll explain everything when we're there. I want to know about Park. I want to know what he's actually planning and what you're actually going to do about it. I know. I'm not going to be managed, she said. Not by him. Not by you. Not by... She stopped. The exhale again. I'm not going to sit somewhere safe while you handle things. Amara, no. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were level, and the thing behind them was the specific combination he'd come to know in her. The fear and the anger and the absolute refusal to let either of them make her small. I'm in this. Whether either of us chose that or not, I'm in this. So tell me what is actually happening. He looked at her in the moving car, the city passing outside the windows, and he thought about the press conference that morning, and the photograph on the car seat, and the coffee cup hitting the pavement, and the 11 minutes he'd spoken on camera in the flat, deliberate voice of a man making a legal record. He thought about everything that was still in motion: Park's assault on the Eastern assets, the compliance timeline, the 6 or 7 hours before the legal machinery started generating friction that even Park couldn't ignore, and what Park would do in those 6 or 7 hours if he understood that the leverage of Amara had been neutralized. He thought about the thing he hadn't said yet, the piece that O had been circling around, the move that closed the last vulnerability in the picture, the one that required something from her that he had no right to ask. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. Park is going to keep coming, not because of the organization. The organization is manageable. The press conference started a process that makes direct conflict increasingly costly for him every hour. But you, he paused, you are a pressure point that exists outside the legal architecture. As long as he thinks he can reach you, he has an argument that the law can't make for me. So what are you saying? He looked at her. I'm saying that the safest version of the next few months for you involves distance. From Seoul. From me. He kept his voice even. I'm not asking you to go. I'm telling you what the picture looks like. You have options. The Georgetown program, your family in Atlanta, the legal internship you told me about in London. Stop, she said. He stopped. Are you telling me to leave, she said, because it's strategically correct? Or because you can't stand the idea of something happening to me and you think distance is the only way you can guarantee it? The car was quiet except for the engine and the city. He looked at her and thought, she followed the sentence exactly where he tried to leave it unfinished, and she did not let him leave it there, and she had been doing that since the first night in the cafe, and she was doing it now in the back of a car running from someone else's war. He said, both. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, Seoul moved past the windows. Somewhere across the city park was receiving a message from a man whose coffee cup was on a university pavement, and Se Jun was managing a crisis at the eastern docks. An illegal filing was working its way through the compliance machinery, and the press conference was being replayed on news feeds and debated in rooms Ji-hoon would never see. Inside the car, Amara Johnson looked at Kang Ji-hoon and said nothing for a full 30 seconds that had the weight of everything. They hadn't said yet, and everything that was still coming that had no clean name yet. She said, I'm not leaving because of Park. He looked at her. I want to be clear about that, she said. I'm not going to be moved around by someone else's threat. If I go anywhere, it's because I decided to go, not because a man I've never met decided I was useful as a pressure point. She held his gaze steadily. So take that off the table as a reason. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated. Then she looked out the window and was quiet for a moment. But I did get a letter last week. He waited. The London internship, the one I told you about. She turned the strap of her laptop bag slowly in her hands. They want an answer by the end of the month. I've been sitting on it because... She stopped. Started again. I've been sitting on it. He looked at the side of her face. The city moved outside the window. Take it, he said. She turned to look at him. Take the internship, he said. Not because of Park, not because of the distance, because you told me in the first hour that you wanted to spend your life closing gaps in statutes, and an internship like that is how you start closing them. Take it. She studied him for a long moment. You're not going to ask me to stay. No? Even though, especially because, he said, if I asked you to stay, I'd be doing what Park did, using what matters to you as a lever. He looked at the window. I don't want to be that. The car moved through the early evening traffic. Ryu drove without speaking. The city outside was doing its ordinary thing. Storefronts lit up, people on the pavement, the first neon beginning to compete with the last daylight. And it looked exactly as it always looked, indifferent and continuous, the way cities look when your particular crisis is not registered in their accounting. Amara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You have to deal with Park first, before any of this means anything. I know. And I'm not going anywhere tonight. I know that too. Park made his final move at 11 that night. Not through Cheon, not through messengers. Park called Ji-hoon directly, on a number that required considerable access to have, which was itself a statement. I can reach you anywhere, which was partly true and partly performance. And Ji-hoon had enough experience with performance to hear the seam in it. He answered. I watched your press conference, Park said. His voice was level in the way of a man managing something. Impressive theater. It wasn't theater, Ji-hoon said. No, I suppose it wasn't. That's what concerns me. A pause. You've made things complicated, Ji-hoon. I want you to understand that I don't hold that against you personally. Complexity is just a different problem to solve. You moved against my people today. I moved against your assets. There's a distinction. I'm a businessman. You put people in a university library. A beat of silence. When Park spoke again, the tone had shifted slightly, something underneath the surface. The girl was a contingency. I didn't expect her to be extracted so cleanly. Take note of that, Ji-hoon said. Whatever you thought the leverage was, it's gone. She's out of your reach, tonight and going forward. For now, permanently. Ji-hoon kept his voice flat. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information, not a threat. The compliance filing went through this morning. By tomorrow afternoon, there will be 3 separate regulatory bodies with copies of the transition documentation. If anything happens to me, to my people, or to anyone connected to me personally, the documentation I have on your operation goes to each of those bodies simultaneously. I built that mechanism before the press conference. It runs automatically. Silence. You've been planning this longer than I thought, Park said. I've been planning parts of it. Other parts I decided this morning. The dead man's switch. Call it what you want. Another silence, longer. Ji-hoon listened to the quality of it. The particular texture of a man recalculating, running new numbers against old positions, finding that the board had changed shape while he was looking at a different part of it. What do you want from me? Park said, finally. I want you to leave the Eastern assets alone for 60 days. The transition is in process. In 60 days, the legal structure is complete, and the operational transfer is done, and there's nothing left for either of us to fight over. And if I don't? Then the filing goes early, and you spend the next 4 years explaining your financials to people who are very good at finding things. Park was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Ji-hoon waited. He was sitting in the apartment in Itaewon, at the desk by the window. Amara was in the next room. He had brought her here because it was the most secured location he had, and because sending her somewhere else had not been something either of them discussed as a real option. He could hear faintly the sound of her moving, her footsteps crossing the floor, the small, ordinary sounds of another person existing in space. He thought, I have been alone in this apartment for 3 years, and I can hear her walking across the floor, and it sounds like something I didn't know I was missing. 60 days, Park said. 60 days. And the documentation stays where it is as long as you stay where you are. Another pause. Then, in a voice that had the quality of a man closing something, setting it down, deciding to let it be over. You're going to be a different kind of problem when you're legitimate, Kang Ji-hoon. Probably, Ji-hoon said. I'm told I'm good at it. He heard Park exhale. Then the line went quiet. Ji-hoon set the phone on the desk and looked at it for a moment. He thought about whether to trust the call, ran the arithmetic of it, Park's position, the exposure he now carried, the cost-benefit of 60 days of quiet against the alternative, and arrived at, probably, yes. Not certainly. Probably. Which was the best available outcome for tonight. He went to find Amara. She was standing at the window in the main room, her coat finally off, her arms crossed, looking at the city. She turned when he came in. Well, she said. 60 days, he said. It's not a guarantee, but it's enough. She looked at him for a moment. Did you believe him? Enough to proceed on it. He's not sentimental about losing battles. He'll move on. She nodded slowly, working through it. Then, your men, the ones at the docks. Ryu is managing, no casualties. Oh held the line. He looked at her. It's not over. The next few months are going to involve a lot of legal process and a lot of things I can't fully predict. But the acute part, tonight's version of it, is done. She exhaled, and it was a long one, the kind that had been held for hours. "Come sit down," he said. She came and sat on the low couch across from the window, and he sat on the other end of it, and they were quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncomfortable. The particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and have not yet found the right words for what it was. "I'm going to take the internship," she said. "I know. I was always going to take it, probably." She turned her cup of cold tea in her hands. She'd made tea while he was on the call, another small ordinary sound he'd registered from the other room. "I just needed to not be running from something when I made the decision. I needed it to be mine." "It's yours," he said. She looked at him. "How are you actually doing with that?" The honest answer? Always. He thought about it seriously, the way she'd taught him to think about questions that deserved the full space. I don't want you to go," he said. "That's real. I won't perform indifference about it." He paused. "But I'm also not going to ask you to make yourself smaller to stay in my radius." "That's also real." He looked at his hands. "Both of those things are true at the same time, and I've had to get used to that." She was quiet for a moment. "When I leave," she said carefully, "what happens to this? To us?" He looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "I know what I'd like. I'd like to find out if it survives the distance. I'd like to call you and hear about the internship and argue about things we're reading and know that it's still real even when there are thousands of miles between it." He paused. "But I'm not going to make that a condition. You get to decide what it is when you're over there, without the pressure of what I'd prefer." She turned the teacup again, once, twice. "You're very different from how you were in September," she said quietly. "I know. You were already—" She paused, choosing the words. "You were already someone, in September. I don't want to make it sound like I built you. That's not what happened. I know that too. I just mean—" She stopped, started again. "I think you were already trying to get somewhere. I just happened to be in the room when you figured out what it looked like." He looked at her. He thought about Se Jun's voice saying the same thing in a different key. "I think you've been trying to get here for a long time." And he thought about the 12-year-old with the scholarship at the school where everyone else's shoes were better, the one who had wanted to build things for everyone. And he thought about the education that had replaced that. And he thought about how long he'd been carrying both of them. "My mother called this afternoon," he said, "after the press conference." Amara looked at him, surprised. This was not a thread he'd pulled before. "She watched it live," he said. "She didn't know the full scope. She knew some of it. The way family knows things they don't ask about directly." He paused. "She was quiet for a long time after I picked up. Then she said, 'I didn't think I'd live to see this.' And she wasn't crying. She was just saying a fact." Amara looked at him with the expression she had when something landed somewhere true, not performing empathy, just receiving it. "I didn't know what to say to her," he said. "So I said, 'I know.' And she said, 'Come see me soon.' And I said, 'I will.'" He stopped. "I'm going to Jeju next week, first time in 8 months." "Good," Amara said. Just that. The same way she'd said it in September when he told her he'd bought his mother a house. No inflation, no sentiment added on top. Just good. As a fact. He looked at her and felt something that had been very heavy for a very long time settle into a different position. Not gone, but differently carried, and he thought, this is what it is when the armor comes off. Not lightness exactly, just weight that fits the actual shape of the person. 3 days later, Ryu confirmed that Park's men had pulled back from all of Ji-hoon's remaining assets. The Incheon and Eastern Dock operations were intact. The legal filing was generating exactly the institutional friction Ji-hoon had predicted. 2 regulatory bodies had already made contact, and the compliance documentation was being reviewed by people who wore suits and used words like fiduciary and oversight without irony. Kim, the compromised lawyer, had been quietly informed that his services were no longer required and that a copy of the transaction records O had found was being held in trust. Not filed, not yet, just held. Kim understood what that meant. Ji-hoon didn't hear from him again. Se Jun came to the office on the fourth day and sat across from Ji-hoon and looked at him with the expression of a man who has been working with someone for 7 years and is seeing them clearly for the first time, or seeing something he'd been choosing not to see before. What happens to the men? Oh said. The ones who've been with the organization. The ones who don't have anywhere to go. Ji-hoon had been thinking about this. I've been in contact with 3 of the legitimate businesses. The construction subsidiary, the logistics company, the Busan import operation. They need workers, real ones, on payroll, with contracts. He looked at O. It's not going to be what they're used to. Some of them won't want it. But it's there. And the ones who don't want it, they leave, with their severance and their history, and whatever they do next is their decision. He paused. I can't make this transition work for everyone. I know that. O was quiet for a moment. What about me? Ji-hoon looked at him. The construction subsidiary needs a director of operations, Ji-hoon said. Someone who understands logistics, who doesn't get rattled under pressure, and who can read a room full of difficult people and know exactly what they're thinking. He held O's gaze. It pays less. Considerably less, I assume. Yes. O looked at the desk. He turned a pen over in his fingers twice, set it down. When do I start? He said. Ji-hoon nodded. Monday. O left. And Ji-hoon sat in the office that was no longer the same office it had been 3 weeks ago. The same furniture and the same view and the same city below the window, but the air of it fundamentally altered. The way a room changes after a long illness ends, or a decision is finally made and there is nothing left to brace against. Amara left for London on a Tuesday morning in November. He drove her to the airport, not the unmarked car, not Ryu. He drove her himself in a car that was just a car, a mid-sized sedan he'd bought through the legitimate side of the holdings and never quite had occasion to use personally. She sat in the passenger seat with her 2 large bags in the back and her carry-on at her feet, and she was wearing the heavy coat and her hair was loose, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has already said their internal goodbyes and is now just moving through the physical mechanics of leaving. They didn't talk much on the drive, not because there was nothing to say, but because most of what needed to be said had already been said in the apartment on the night after Park's call, and in the days after that, over the small, ordinary accumulation of hours that they'd been careful with, both of them, knowing each one had a number. At the departure's drop-off, he pulled over and she unfolded herself from the seat, and he got out and pulled her bags from the back and set them on the pavement, and she stood there with her carry-on over her shoulder, looking at him in the cold November air. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he said. You're going to be unrecognizable by then, she said. All legitimate. Business cards that actually reflect what you do. Probably giving speeches at industry events. I'm not giving speeches. You gave a press conference. That was different. She almost smiled. That preliminary thing, the one that happened before the decision to smile. He had learned its geography over months, and he did not want to stop being in proximity to it, which was a fact he held without doing anything with it, because there was nothing to do with it except let it be true. Call me when you land, he said. You'll be asleep. Time zones. Call me anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, her face against the side of his jaw, brief and real, and he put his arms around her and held on and felt the weight of the coat and her carry-on strap digging slightly into his shoulder and the cold air around both of them, and he thought, remember this, not as a loss, as a true thing. She stepped back. She picked up her bags. Ji-hoon, she said. Yes, you were real with me. She said it looking directly at him, no performance in it. Eventually, imperfectly, but real. She paused. That matters. Not a lot of people are. He looked at her. Go close some gaps, he said. She turned and walked through the departure's door, and he watched her until the crowd took her, and then he stood there for a moment on the pavement in the cold and the airport noise, and he thought about a cafe near Yonsei in October rain, 4 hours. A woman arguing about accountability with the focused patience of someone who was not trying to win but was trying to understand. And he thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one, and he thought, I stayed. Past the 10 minutes, and past the identity, and past the version of myself that didn't know what it wanted. I stayed. He got back in the car. The 60 days passed. They were not easy days. The regulatory process was slow and demanded things: documents, appearances, explanations delivered in conference rooms to people who looked at him with careful professional neutrality and asked questions in the particular language of institutional accountability. He answered every question. He brought his lawyers, and he answered every question, and some of the answers were uncomfortable, and he gave them anyway, in the same flat, deliberate voice he'd used at the press conference. And each time he gave them, it felt like handing something over that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. Park did not move. Park had his own problems. 3 of the regulatory bodies Se Jun's filing had apparently found Park's name in the documentation, and Park was now occupied with a different set of conferences in different conference rooms. Se Jun heard about this through channels and felt no particular satisfaction, which surprised him slightly. He'd thought he would feel satisfaction. What he felt was something more like relief, and the difference between the two said something about where he was now that he didn't need to articulate to anyone. Choi came to see him in the 6th week. They sat in a restaurant in Se Jun, a good one, the kind of place with actual tablecloths, and Choi ordered for both of them with the authority of a man who had been doing this since they were 12 and had opinions about food that Se Jun had always been willing to defer to. "You look different," Choi said. "You look the same," Se Jun said. "I mean it." Something in the... Choi gestured vaguely at Se Jun's general vicinity. "I don't know. You're not always somewhere else." Se Jun picked up his tea. "I've been working on that." "I know. I watched the press conference 6 times. Choi said it without embarrassment, the way he said most things, with the particular directness of a man who had decided a long time ago that pretending not to feel things was more work than it was worth. "My wife cried. She didn't know you well enough to know why she was crying. She just cried." Se Jun looked at the table. "How is she?" Choi asked. "The Georgetown student?" "In London. She's been there 3 weeks." "And?" "We talk." Se Jun turned his cup. "She sent me a photograph of a building last week, Victorian. Said the proportions were wrong, but the bones were good." He paused. "She said it reminded her of something I'd told her." Choi looked at him with the look he'd had at 12, the one that meant he understood more than he was saying and had decided not to say it. "She's going to come back," Choi said. "She might." "I know people, Se Jun. I've known you for 30 years and I know people. She's coming back." Se Jun said nothing. "But that's not even the point," Choi said. "Is it?" Se Jun looked at his old friend, at the face that had been the same face for 30 years, at the man who had called in a favor because he hadn't wanted a foreign student to sit alone in a cafe waiting for someone who wasn't coming, and he thought about the particular randomness of the things that changed you, the specific smallness of the moments that contained the largest alterations. "No," Se Jun said, "that's not the point." He went to Jeju the following week. His mother lived in a white house near the coast, modest and very clean, with a garden she tended with the focused attention she had once applied to survival. She was 61 and looked younger, which Se Jun thought had something to do with finally living somewhere that didn't require every day to be a negotiation. She made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table, and outside the window the ocean did what it did, continuous and uninterested in the occasion. She didn't ask him about the press conference. She didn't ask about the legal process or Park or the restructuring. She asked about Amara. She asked with the careful, precise curiosity of a woman who had learned through long experience to read between what her son said and what he meant, and who had heard enough in the 2-minute phone call after the press conference to understand the shape of something she had been waiting a long time to see. He told her. More than he'd intended, less than everything. He told her about the cafe and the rain and the 4 hours, and he told her about the park at Bukhansan and the argument about accountability, and he told her about Amara standing at the departure's door in the heavy coat and saying you were real with me, eventually, imperfectly, but real. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at the ocean through the window. "The important thing," she said, "is not whether she comes back. The important thing is who you were while she was here, and who you stay now that she's not." He looked at his mother. He thought about failing infrastructure and 18 months without elevator service, and a 12-year-old who wanted to build parks. He thought about the education that had replaced that. He thought about the length of the distance between who he had been and where he was sitting. "I know," he said. She nodded, like that was the answer she needed. On the evening of the 60th day, Ji-hoon stood on the rooftop of the building in Itaewon, where he'd lived for 3 years. It was cold. November had completed its argument and December had begun making its own case. The city below him was fully lit now, the winter dark arriving early, Seoul in its nighttime form. Not the reflective rain-blurred version of October, but the sharp, clear version, the one where the cold made everything precise, every light distinct, every sound carrying further than it should. His phone was in his pocket. Amara had texted an hour ago, "How's day 60?" He'd replied, "Quiet." She'd sent back, "Good quiet or just quiet?" He'd written, "Both." Then after a moment, "Mostly good." She'd sent, "I found a building today, Georgian, 1790s. Someone converted the interior in the 1960s and got it completely wrong, but the exterior is perfect. I stood outside it for 20 minutes. He'd written, "Did you take a photograph?" She'd sent the photograph. He'd looked at it for a long time, a Georgian townhouse in a London street. The proportions exactly what she'd said. The bones of it visible in the clean vertical lines, and the symmetry, the kind of building that had been designed with the intention of lasting, built by someone who believed the structure was worth making correctly. He'd written, "The bones are good." She'd replied, "That's what I said." He stood on the rooftop and looked at the city and held the phone in his hand and thought about bones, about structures that lasted, about the difference between building something to serve whoever owned it and building something meant for everyone, and about how long it took a person to understand which one they were actually capable of. He thought about the 12-year-old. He thought about the 42 floors of shell corporations and the unmarked cars, and the decades of the particular numbness that had been furniture, the kind you stopped noticing, the kind you only understood had been there when it was finally gone, and the room felt different without it. He thought about Se Jun on his first day at the construction subsidiary, standing in a site office in Incheon with a hard hat in his hands, looking at a wall of project diagrams with the same wound-tight focus he'd brought to everything for 7 years, directed now at load-bearing calculations and supply chain logistics, and how Ji-hoon had stood in the doorway and watched and felt something that was not quite pride, but lived in the same neighborhood. He thought about his mother's hands around her teacup and her voice saying, "The important thing is who you stay now that she's not." He thought about Amara in the departures hall, her face against his jaw, brief and real. He looked at the city he had run for 15 years, the city that had given him the education and the empire and the particular cold clarity of a man who understood how structures worked, all of it, the whole weight and shape of it. And he thought, "I did not love you well. I used you. I took from you the way the building owner took from the people who couldn't afford to go anywhere else. I knew the exemption, and they didn't." He thought, "I know how to do something different, not redemption." He didn't use that word, had no patience for the architecture of it, the way it required a clean arc and a moment of arrival, and the suggestion that accounts could be settled and balances returned to zero. That was not the world he'd grown up in, or the one he lived in now. There were things he'd done that had permanent weight, and he would carry them, specifically, without the comfort of a narrative that dissolved them into lesson learned. But there was also this, the rooftop, the cold, the city below him, the phone in his hand with a photograph of a Georgian building in London, sent by a woman who still saw like an architect, even when she was looking at the law. There was also this, 60 days held, a process begun, a structure being built not for whoever owned it, but for something larger than that, something that had taken him long enough to see that he was not going to waste the scene of it. His phone buzzed. Amara, still on the rooftop? He looked at the screen, then up at the city. He typed, "How did you know I was on the rooftop?" She replied, "You always go up there when you need to think. I learned your patterns." He stood there in this cold and the dark, and the particular quiet of a city that was too large to be fully quiet, and he thought about patterns, about the ones that were worth keeping and the ones that had needed breaking, and about how strange and specific and unplannable it was. The mechanism of being truly known by another person, the way it required you to stop managing the picture and let the actual thing be seen. He typed, "I was thinking about bones." She replied, "The building?" He typed, "Buildings in general. The difference between ones built to last and ones built for whoever owned them." A pause. Then, That's either architecture or metaphor. He typed, probably both. Another pause. Then, Se Jun. He waited. She wrote, I'm coming back in March. Not because of you, because Georgetown has a spring program and Yonsei is a partner institution, and it makes sense for my research. He read it twice. He typed, of course. She wrote, but also a little because of you. He looked at the city. He looked at the lights on the Han River, the same lights, the same river, the same city that had been here before him and would be here long after, carrying everyone's choices in its ordinary indifferent motion. He typed, I'll be here. She replied, I know. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood on the rooftop in the cold December dark and looked at Seoul and breathed, and the breath showed in the air and dissolved, and the city went on doing what it did. And somewhere in it, the construction subsidiary was working on a residential project in Incheon that was going to add 200 units of affordable housing to a district that needed it. And somewhere in it, the compliance documentation was in its third month of review. And somewhere in it, Se Jun was probably in a site office, being told the concrete pour was behind schedule, and was responding with the focused ferocity of a man who had redirected his life's energy and had no intention of wasting the redirection. And somewhere across 8,000 kilometers, a woman in London had just sent her last message and put down her phone, and was probably picking up a legal brief or looking out a window at Georgian Bones or both at the same time, because she was the kind of person who always had more than one thing running, and she was going to be exactly what she'd told him she was going to be, in the first hour, in the cafe in the rain. And he was going to be there to see it, not to own it, not to use it as leverage or evidence or proof of something about himself, just to be in proximity to it, the way you stand near something that reminds you what you're building toward. He turned from the railing. He went inside. The door closed behind him, and the city went on, and the cold stayed in the air where he'd been standing, and after a moment even that was gone.